Stephen King's It is secretly about overcoming systemic oppression with intersectional solidarity. Maybe. I watched the miniseries as a young pup, and I saw the movies in theaters when they came out, and now I've read the book. And let me tell you, I have some thoughts. But first... Now, if you're watching this video, you're probably familiar with the story of It by Stephen King, either from the book or you saw the recent 2017-2019 movies, or maybe you're an old curmudgeon like me and you grew up with the Tim Curry starring miniseries from the 90s, which traumatized me so much as a young pup that I reverted back to taking baths after that locker room shower scene fucked me up so badly. Anyways, just to recap the story, in a sleepy little New England town of Derry, there is a horrible shape-shifting clown monster from outer space which lives in the sewers and feeds on children, or like feeds on their fears. How does it know what their fears are? I guess it can like read minds, or maybe because it lives in the sewers, it hears the kids talking about their fears. I forget if that specific detail is explained. Either way, it shapeshifts into their worst fears to scare them to feed on their fears. It's a real bummer. So in response, a group of misfits, of unlikely heroes, a losers club, if you will, made up of Bill, Eddie, Ben, Richie, Stan, Beverly, and Mike, band together to stop it. They track it down, there's an epic battle, and it scurries away. But they're not sure if they really killed it for good, so they make a promise to return to fight the monster if they must, which of course they do. So they return to Derry 27 years later as adults to kill it for good, which they do. The end. That's essentially the story, right? Now, whether you're talking about the text or the adaptations, if we put on our thinking caps and we think about what the story symbolizes, what the themes are, then we might see that this is a story about trauma. Beverly has a controlling, abusive father. Bill is teased for his stutter. Stanley is Jewish in the 50s. Ben is teased for being fat. Eddie's mother is an overbearing hypochondriac. Mike exists while being black in America. And Richie gets it worst of all. He's teased for being what we essentially refer to these days as a gamer, the most oppressed class of people. Anyways, to top it all off, there's a school bully, Henry Bowers, and his gang of friends, Victor, Belch, and Patrick, who all bully this losers club. And that's to say nothing about the shape-shifting clown monster, which traumatizes the kids first with their childhood fears, mummies, blood, germs, or whatever, and then as adults, it re-traumatizes them by shape-shifting into their childhood traumas, transforming into Beverly's abusive father, making fun of Bill's stutter, calling Ben fat, calling Mike the N-word, and things like that. As an adult, Richie reflects on things in this way. What a bunch of losers they had been. Stan Uris with his big Jew boy nose. Bill Denborough, who could say nothing but hi-ho silver without stuttering so badly that it drove you almost dogshit. Beverly Marsh with her bruises and her cigarettes rolled up in the sleeve of her blouse. Ben Hanscom, who had been so big he looked like the human version of Moby Dick. And Richie Tozer with his thick glasses and his A average and his wise mouth and his face which just begged to be pounded into new and exciting shapes. You get the idea. If you're familiar with this story at all, I'm sure this is just a recap for you. But I think there are some things that the miniseries and films miss about this story.
Don't you want a balloon?
You see, there's this gigantic cosmic turtle who needs the strength of a bunch of children who are tripping balls and whose friendship is linked by their elementary school orgy that they had to connect each other enough to overcome the astral projection of an intergalactic... Okay. I'm not actually going to talk about that stuff from the book. Maybe you've read the book, or maybe you've seen like a video or article talking about some of the zanier stuff that's in this book, which never makes it into the adaptations. But no, that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Let's talk about systemic oppression and intersectional solidarity. You see, I don't think the story is just about trauma. I think it's about systemic oppression. In addition to the personal experiences the main characters have, there are 5 interludes to each section of this book where Mike conducts interviews and research detailing the history of the town and the horrors caused by it, adding a more systemic backdrop to the trauma the main characters face as individuals. For example, it's not just that Beverly's dad abuses her and that as an adult she has an abusive boyfriend. She's also assaulted and harassed by Henry's gang of bullies. And as an adult, there's a detailed look at how Beverly's boyfriend cultivated this abusive relationship. And with help from a friend, Beverly is able to escape that abuse so she can return to help her friends in Derry. but the boyfriend tracks down and beats up this friend in order to track Beverly down. There's a lot more to this than just an individual's experience with abuse. And looking at the interludes, where Mike details the town's history, there are several cases of murders or missing children, which are blamed on abuse or neglect of the parents, and the cops just seem to turn a blind eye or do very little to address the problem. Mike asks the chief of police about the record number of missing children in the 1930s, and the chief responds, "It was the Depression. Most of them probably got tired of eating potato soup or going flat hungry." Mike asks about the 127 that went missing in 1958 when there was no depression. The officer still just says, "They were runaways, who cares?" Mike asks, "What about the 3-year-old who was reported missing? Was he a runaway?" And the officer just shuts the conversation down and goes back to doing something else. Society turning a blind eye to this abuse. As for Ben, he isn't only called fat by the school bullies. The teachers get in on the action as well. After Henry and the other bullies steal Ben's clothes and slap him around and release him naked and bruised into the gymnasium, the coach doesn't comfort him or punish the bullies, but instead he grabs at Ben's fat and says, "You disgust them and you disgust me as well. It's a lot of stupid self-indulgence and it makes me want to puke." This isn't just about bullies. The fat shaming is socially imposed. Even the bully Henry Bowers isn't free from systemic oppression, his being based around his class. He's blamed for the murders of his own friends, who It killed in the story, and he is convicted, probably because he's a hillbilly delinquent who didn't have a good lawyer or anything, so he ends up in a mental institution. And when It asks adult Henry to kill the members of the Losers Club, he doesn't just say to avenge his friends or, get them back for not fighting for his innocence regarding the murders. No, he uses the voices of the children to mock Henry for being poor. The voices of the kids that had gotten him into this in the first place whispered down from the ghost moon. "You couldn't even catch a fat boy, Bowers," one of them whispered. "Now I'm rich, and you're hoeing peas. Read any good books since you've been in there? I wrote lots. I'm rich, and you're in Juniper Hill. You chased me and couldn't catch me, and I got rich too. Way to go, Banana Heels." On the systemic level, looking at the history of this logging town, there was an incident where a few union organizers in the lumber industry in Derry had a strike, which was put down by scabs and town officials cracking heads. But the organizers still felt pretty pumped up and wanted to celebrate. However, their celebrations didn't go according to plan. There were 4 of them who spent that night in the Brentwood's Arms Hotel. 4 checked in, none checked out. 2 of the other ringleaders, Amsel Brickfork and Davy Hartwell himself, were found floating face down in the Kandutski. Pinned to the back of each man's shirt was a paper with the word Union on it. Now, Richie isn't gay in the book, as he is in the 2019 movie. However, there is some homosexual tension between the bully's Henry and his friend Patrick. Beverly sees Patrick masturbate both himself and Henry and offers Henry a blowjob. Due to the homophobia and such, Henry pushes him to the ground and demands Patrick not tell anyone what happened, and Henry storms off, leaving Patrick alone, who was then targeted and killed by It. Bringing this to the systemic level, the first killings of the modern cycle of the It killings, which brings the Losers Club back to Derry as adults, is the killing of Adrian Mellon. Adrian met Dawn Haggerty in a local gay bar called the Falcon. Adrian likes Derry, but Dawn, a local, wants them to move away because of the town's rampant homophobia. For example, a wall of graffiti. "Stick nails in the eyes of every F word for God." There's a lot of this stuff, and I don't think one person wrote it all. But they don't move away in time, because while they're walking and holding hands and such, some local folks launch into a homophobic attack and beat up Adrian and throw him off a bridge where he's then eaten by It. When talking to the police, Dawn says, "It was Derry, it was this town," meaning that the homophobia, the murder, the clown, they're all linked in this systemic oppression kind of way. Also, the folks responsible for the murder basically get away with it. Only one of them is charged and gets 6 months, but is released because they're a minor. Now let's have a look at Mike. You see, in the book, Mike isn't just the token black character. His family history is the history of racism in this town, and in America as a whole. While in the army in Derry, Mike's dad is frequently called the N-word by a sergeant who makes him dig and fill pointless holes over and over again because he dared to speak to him before being spoken to. With Mike's father concluding of the incident, "He let me go, and I waited to see if his name would go up on the punishment roster the next day, but it never did. They probably gave him a medal instead of potatoes to peel." And that's how things were for Company E here in Derry. And things didn't get much better after this. You see, the black soldiers weren't allowed in the club for white soldiers, so they would frequent the shady bars in town where the local loggers and sex workers hung out. But the town's leaders didn't want these black folks mingling like that, hanging out with white workers and having sex with the white sex workers. As Mike's dad puts it, it wasn't the few women who traveled the pigs, and it wasn't the lumberjacks that made up their main custom who wanted us out. It was those 5 old men in the town council who were really offended. So to solve this problem, the town council gave the black soldiers an old dirt floor shack to set up as a little restaurant, bar, place to hang out, which they called the Black Spot. However, trouble arises when the cool jazz music that plays at the Black Spot starts attracting white clientele. Soon the Black Spot is doing really well, taking business from other bars, and worse still, it's the very race mixing that the town leaders were trying to stop in the first place. So, the Legion of White Decency, which is described as the northern version of the KKK, which was made up of the same military and town leaders who banned the black soldiers from the local hangouts and set up the Black Spot in the first place, they rode in their white hoods and torches, setting fire to the Black Spot and murdering 60 people in the process. After leaving the army, Mike's father got a farm in Derry, where Mike is born, and now Mike's personal experience with the town's racism comes in. Mike's father with his farm and Henry Bowers' father with their farm, leading into conflict where Henry's father blames Mike's father for every shortcoming and disadvantage they face. The book explains it in this way. In Henry's ears was a constant litany. The N-word, the N-word, the N-word. Everything was the N-word's fault. This leads to a handful of incidents where Henry kills Mike's dog, rubs mud in his face to make him more black, throws firecrackers and M80s at him, beats him up, and throws a barrage of racial slurs at him. Like a lot. The N-word is used over 100 times in this book. This all brings us to intersectional solidarity, which I think goes a little deeper than just each character symbolizing an oppressed group, Mike and racism, Beverly misogyny, Stan and anti-Semitism, Bill and a white boy who writes horror stories or whatever. It's a little deeper than that. For example, it shapeshifts into a giant bird to scare Mike based on his fears individually. But Stan has this idea that the other kids would not have seen a bird when looking at it, but now that they've heard Mike's story, they would see it too. As it's stated in the book, the bird was Mike Hamlin's personal monster, but now that bird was property of the whole Losers Club, wasn't it? It's as if they don't see each other's fears until they talk about it with each other. The same way that Beverly might not experience racism in town. Mike might not experience the misogyny in town. But they can talk about the injustices with each other and explain it in such a way that they build connections and form solidarity. All intersectional and stuff. And of course, the key idea of solidarity is that we can't let sectarianism and factionalism divide us in our fight for justice. We have to work together. And the Losers Club, of course, does the same. The kids are no match for Henry and his gang when they face them alone. But together, like in the epic rock fight, through solidarity, they win against Henry and his bully buddies. Beverly can't seem to clean the blood that it is putting all over the bathroom, but when the gang works together, the blood stops. And in their battles against it, their weakest moments are when they're separated, and they only attain victory when they all work together. These next two ideas are a bit of a stretch, but hear me out. There might be some nods towards apathy and even the white moderate. Folks covering up the various crimes in town, no justice after the burning of the Black Spot, the rampant homophobic graffiti, that time where Beverly is being groped and kissed by Henry and his gang, and an old man sees what's happening, and instead of helping, he just goes inside and does nothing. The cops not doing what's needed about the missing kids. It's a reflection of the real-world response to systemic oppression. Also, after they kill it for the final time as adults, they start forgetting everything about Derry. They cannot remember if Eddie had asthma or something else, if Ben was fat, or maybe he had a club foot. Obviously, this ties to the forgetting themes of the whole book, like the losers growing up and forgetting their childhoods, and the way that townfolk often act as if nothing's wrong when things go wrong. However, if we think about it as fighting for justice over adversity, it's like the Marxist idea that when the working class has a revolution, they will destroy not only the capitalist class, but also the working class themselves as class distinctions. Like, after defeating their injustices, the Losers Club no longer needs to stand together as a fighting force against those injustices, so it all fades away. In fact, the erasing goes even further than this. After it is killed, there's earthquakes and sewer collapses or whatever, thus physically erasing the town's troubled past. The shopping mall is destroyed, a Raytheon factory that was going to be built in town is canceled, the town's tramp chair, a torture device used to lock up tramps and hobos so they could be publicly mocked, the town's tramp chair falls through the second floor into the police station, killing that good-for-nothing police chief that was so apathetic towards solving the problems in Derry. The battle is won, and the town is beginning to heal. At least that's how I see it. My main point here is that when the adaptations focus on the trauma aspects of the story and how it impacts the characters' lives individually, we ignore the systemic oppression that is so prevalent in the story. We miss out on the systemic nature of those problems that led to those traumas in the first place. A story about the power of friendship helping you overcome trauma is an awesome story, and one that's really needed when so many of our stories are about superficial enemies defeated by individual heroes. But a story about how we have to work together to fight systemic oppression, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, fatphobia, frickin' stuttering discrimination, that's a cool, better story. It's a more gooder adaptation of the story. Fuck, I'm tired. Okay. For fun, let's have a look at starting with the 1990s miniseries. Well, Tim Curry knocks it out of the park. Just friendly enough to be believable that he tricks little kids, but still creepy enough to be a movie monster. 10 out of 10, no notes, great stuff. Beverly's abusive boyfriend is not as severely abusive as he is in the book, and the history and cultivation of that abusive relationship is missing. Also, the friend who helps her escape the boyfriend, the one who's later beaten up herself, she's missing from the story as well, which I think really takes away from the importance of support structures when it comes to leaving abusive partners. Eddie lives with his mom instead of having a wife who is like his mom, so he's kinda cucked on that one. Mike gets it worst of all. Sure, Henry calls Mike the N-word and says that his family has been giving him and his dad grief, a slight reference to the racism, but just barely. Really doesn't give the town's history of racism the treatment it deserves. And the anti-Semitism, union folks being murdered, the gay characters being murdered, all of that's completely cut from this adaptation. The 2017 movie. Well, Bill Skarsgård is most certainly terrifying, but perhaps too much so? I can't buy him manipulating children, he's too scary. So I'm gonna give Tim Curry the prize on this one. As for the racism, Henry tells Mike to get lost, but otherwise the racism is completely washed out of the story. No use of the N-word, no telling Mike that their dads have beef or anything like that. Mike's folks were killed in a fire, which is an homage to the burning of the black spot in the book, but still, honestly, I think the 90s miniseries handled the systemic racism a little better. It's a low bar, since none of the adaptations really do it justice. In this adaptation, Ben is made the kid obsessed with history, which takes away from Mike's character even more, but more on that later. Judaism is brought up more in this adaptation, where it's basically absent from the 90s adaptation. There's more anti-Semitism discussed in the book than there is here, but actually, I think the adaptation does things better here than in the book, because the losers have solidarity around the Judaism, where in the book, the losers make fun of Stan for being Jewish just as much as anyone else. Lastly, the 2019 movie. They keep the homophobic killing of Adrian Mellon, which is more true to the story than the 90s adaptation, which is nice, but of course the book gives more detail about the town's overall homophobia. They have Mike as the historian/librarian as an adult, which makes less sense now since Ben was the kid historian in the previous movie. Oops. Beverly's abuse, I think, is done better in this adaptation than the one in the 90s, because it's subtly more graphic, and more importantly, the bruise that she gets from her boyfriend is shown throughout the movie, which is a nice touch. Still, neither adaptation gives the full history and cultivation of that abuse as is discussed in the book. Making Henry's dad a cop kind of ruins that antagonism between Mike's dad and Henry's dad as the white farmer and black farmer interacting in a racist country. I thought maybe Henry's dad being a cop was going to lead to some cool exploration of the town's racist history and systemic racism within the criminal justice system, but to no avail. Lastly, Richie being gay is a nice touch in this adaptation, a way to further explore the history of homophobia in Derry without having to refer to Henry's friend Patrick as gay, which would probably be a little too complicated to try and put into a movie. But yeah, I think that's about it. Okay, let's be fair here. Is this story really about using intersectional solidarity to overcome systemic oppression? Now I know, death of the author and all that. So rather than using Stephen King's woke Twitter posts as an example of left-leaning sentiment, let's strictly talk about the text and see if this story is really about using intersectional solidarity to overcome systemic oppression. Well, no, probably not. For one, any story about underdogs working together against a common enemy could be seen as a story about solidarity, right? So it's a little bit of a stretch to say that it's a big theme to this story in particular. Sure, we get close to talking about systemic oppression with references to the murdering of gay folks and black folks and union workers, but is this about looking at systemic oppression, or is this about bringing up edgy stuff from America's past? Not unlike bringing up a witch trial or the desecration of a Native American burial ground. I mean, to be honest with you, only a few of the it-related murders in the town's history could be linked to systemic oppression. The black folks killed in the burning of the Black Spot, and the gay couple who's attacked. The story of the union workers that were killed is actually a lot more about the one worker taking revenge years later, and not about the initial killings of the union workers themselves. And that's to say nothing about the settlement that goes missing in 1740, the guy who kills his own family in 1851, the Kitchener Ironworks explosion that killed 108 people in 1906, the killing of the Bradley Gang in 1929, and the seemingly random killing of kids in 1957 when the Losers Club is formed. Also, there are disparaging remarks made about political metaphors and symbolism in storytelling in this book itself. When Stephen King, Bill Demborough, reflects on his time at a liberal arts college where he learned to be a writer, there's talk about how the professors all prefer high-minded, symbolic, political, high-minded stuff, and they thought that Bill's horror stories were lowbrow trash. With Bill stating, "Why does a story have to be socio-anything? Politics, culture, history, aren't those natural ingredients in any story if it's told well?" Okay, so it's hard to tell here if he's exactly for or against larger symbolic meaning in stories, but then he clarifies. I mean, can't you guys just let a story be a story? Well, shit. Maybe the whole social justice theme is now shot to shreds. In fact, Bill, the Stephen King surrogate of the story, basically puts the last nail in the coffin, stating, "If fiction and politics ever really do become interchangeable, I'm going to kill myself." Well, damn. I guess that settles it. Or does it? I mean, it could go either way, pun intended. The kids working together to stand up to their traumas, the way these traumas are tied to the larger issues of systemic oppression in town, the way the characters understand each other's traumas by talking it out and working together, it certainly seems like the themes of intersectional solidarity and systemic oppression are clear as day. But the story also often pulls away from a more systemic reading of these conflicts, always clarifying that X or Y incident was specific to Derry and not representative of anything as a whole. For example, Mike's father, when talking about the burning of the Black Spot, he says that it might have been an accident, and that "I don't really think it happened because we was black. It's because of that soil. It seems that bad things, hurtful things do right well in the soil of this town." It's like, dude, it was literally rich, racist white guys in white hoods burning down a black club because they didn't like the race mixing. But okay, it wasn't about race, nothing socio-political here, it was actually just it controlling people and making the town bad, apparently. I don't know. Is the story about intersectional solidarity and systemic oppression, or not? Is it plain as day, or maybe I'm reading too much into it? Again, pun intended. Why don't you tell me what you think down there in the comment section below? Come on down to the comment section where you'll float. We'll all float down there. You'll
all float. You'll all float.